Welcome to another edition of Enfield First. This is part two. We still have Phil Kober here from the Board of Ed.
All right,
and we're going to discuss some more financial, budgetary stuff, exciting stuff for everybody out there, I'm sure. Last time we discussed the $75 million budget. This time, and really, is it $75 million? Is that the cost of the kids for the education in Enfield?
Yeah, Bob. So I'm glad to be back and kind of dive more into it. So when we talk about the $75 million budget, we're talking about the Board of Ed's budget, correct? But that is actually not the all-inclusive cost that the taxpayers are expending. And I think one of the other big pieces that a lot of people need to realize is the school facilities and buildings are actually no longer part of the Board of Ed budget. They now fall under the council. So when we're talking about, things like maintenance, upkeep,
insurance,
janitorial services, all that stuff, that's actually now funded through the town council's budget and not through the Board of Ed side of it.
Yes, it is. 15 to 18 million, somewhere in there is the in-kind line from what I can remember.
Correct. I believe that's about what I've heard. I know I personally haven't viewed it just because, it doesn't fall under our scope.
Another big thing that came up this year was the security program that the town is now paying for, I believe about $800,000.
Correct. And that was another part that the Board of Ed was only able to actually fund that through COVID grant money a few years ago when we started putting security officers in the school. Now that money is no longer coming in, this last budget cycle was actually a big topic of conversation because, of course, once you have security, you don't want to take it away. It's people now expect it. So that line item, per se, is now moved over to the town council. And I recall it was originally about $1 million was the cost, and through the efforts of the council, you guys were able to get it down to a little over $800,000.
Yep. So we're closing in on the $100 million area of costs for the education.
Correct. When we're looking at the big picture and you start adding up all the expenditures and all the other upfront and maybe subdued costs, you're looking at near $100 million.
So one of the questions I get is the population going up in our schools or is it going down?
So the population in the town might be static, but our student enrollment actually is going down. If you look historically through our numbers and you look through the EdSite portal, which is where we report all our attendance and enrollment, over the past decade at least, our numbers have been going down. We currently have just over 4,800 students in the Enfield Public Schools.
Okay. Yeah, that does sound like a down number from years past.
Exactly. And I think that's part of the bigger things you're seeing with society now. People are having less kids. People might not be able to afford to have kids, so on and so forth. So as the population kind of stays the same and the birth rate declines, you see less and less students coming in.
Yep. But on the other side, inflation and the cost of everything is going up. So some of the costs that you see on the budget line, what are we looking at here?
Exactly. So all the costs, unfortunately, are going the other way, right? Enrollment might be going down, costs are going up. And when you're talking about the Board of Ed, we have some key line items, and then we have some smaller stuff. So the biggest expense, like any business that you run, is going to be employees and payroll. Exactly. And in our budget, it's probably between 80 and 85% of our budget is just payroll. And the other 10 to 15% might be property, supplies, contracted services, stuff like that, like school bus transportation. But again, that payroll is a huge thing. Payroll, benefits, insurance, workman's comp, all that type of stuff is the lion's share, per se, of our budget.
Okay. So when we're seeing these financials by the month, and just like your checkbook, you want to make sure you're balanced. Do we see big skews where we're doing big payments and falling behind, or are we always in that balance area?
We're generally in a balance area of what we do in our monthly reports. However, there is a slight differential for the Board of Ed where we have what we'll call 9-month employees and we'll have 12 months employees, I'm sorry. So the full year 12 months employees will be basically just your administrators, and they're there year round. Your principals, your directors, your superintendent, assistant superintendent, and so forth. Then the rest of the staff in the school, the teachers, paraprofessionals, cafeteria workers, they only work during the school year, which, normally 180 days. Their contract might bring them to 187, 188 days based on professional development and stuff like that. So those 9-month employees are only paid during that period. They're not paid during the summer. So you will see some ups and downs just from the June, July, August, per se, when we're only paying a fraction of our workers that are there year round.
Okay, perfect. Great explanation on that also.
Cool.
So Phil, at the last meeting, I remember Assistant Superintendent was talking about a contingency fund being built up again, which is one of the big things that we've always stressed, to have that extra fund, because we talked about extra costs coming in, which we see all the time in the Board of Ed here, and the school department. There's extra costs come in. So how are we building up that contingency fund? How important do you see that that to have?
So that's a very good question. I think that's a very important thing to look at. So as you're familiar, the state law allows us to have a 2% carryover of our budget that essentially becomes a contingency fund. So when we look at our budget, 75 million, and you take 2% of that, that's what we're allowed to roll over from year to year. Now, previously we had talked about last year's budget where we had spent more than we were able to reimburse ourselves. So we didn't really have a carryover per se. After all the money and the bills came in, there may have been a little money that was unallocated that was rolled into this fund, but it was nothing significant that we were able to use going into this year. And I think we saw some of the residual effects where, staff had to be reduced. We started with this clean slate, and now we're moving into this new year. So with the contingency fund now, the goal is to build that back up to the 2%. I think it's a very important number to have, and it's all we're allowed to carry over by law. And one of the reasons I think that it's important is when you have unexpected and unreimbursed expenses during the school year. Last year, one of the big things that the district saw was an influx of special needs students moving into the district. Now, due to outplacement, special services, and things of that sort, it increased our expenditures during that school year. And that was one of the things that we just weren't able to keep up with. So had we had a contingency saved up, we would have been able to apply that to perhaps offset some of those increased costs. In this current year, we're projecting to have a carryover. It might not be the full 2%, but I think we're aiming for at least 1%, if not more. So I know we're working to build that back, and of course we do have some bills, and part of the memorandum of understanding with us is paying the town back some of that money. So there will be a little chip away at it, but that is the point of the contingency, is to have it for when you need it.
I think that's some of the realistic budgeting you talked about, instead of just hope and a prayer budgeting. We're realistically budgeting this cost, and this is where we should end up at the end of the year.
Exactly. Every year we do need to be honest that the budget is an estimate of what that upcoming year is going to cost, right? You can project certain things like salary, staffing, enrollment, pretty close to what it's going to be, because we have contracts. We can look at the trends, and we know how many students and staff we have are going to be.
Speaking of trends, the unexpected costs you talk about, special needs students, right? Is that a trend that we're going to see continue?
So it's hard to guess on that, but based on the information and the research we've seen, we do kind of predict that it will continue to increase. I think part of that is where we're at as a society, and still we're in that post-pandemic era of COVID where a lot of students maybe didn't have the supports and they weren't exposed to as many things as previous students were. So I think we are seeing an increase in certain things, like some of the mental health needs, social emotional learning needs, and stuff like that. So that is a realistic thing that we do need to plan for that to go up.
I think it's another reason to fight at the state, because the state is going to have to chip in some more money for these local towns, because you see what's happening to the local towns just don't have that buffer zone or the extra money to cover this. It's got to come from the state to help out, because the local taxpayer is getting killed on this.
Exactly. That's huge. And I think one of the blessings of the pandemic was that additional funding that came in, whether it was ARPA money, ESSER money, and all those other grants that allowed the districts to bring in more social workers, guidance counselors, and different PT and OT services that we could provide in town and keep students having those services here. Rather than if we have a student that needs a service and we don't have that service, now we have to outplace and send that student somewhere else. And that costs us significantly more money than if we were able to provide those services in-house.
Well, I really appreciate the explanation here, and I think one of the reasons we're going to get out of this better than we were before is because we're going to see some of this stuff clear, transparent, whatever the word is. People are going to actually understand where the money's going, and having that understanding is where you control it.
Exactly. I think that's huge for the elected officials, for administrators, and also for the public at large to know where your tax dollars are going and how they're being spent. So I think the open communication, quarterly updates, having conversations just like these are a huge part of this puzzle.
And I appreciate it, and we'll do it again soon, hopefully, and Enfield first.
Definitely. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
I'm Bob Hendrickson, and I approve this message.